Hi everyone, it's Ken here. And by here, I mean I'm finally in my new finished workshop. Let's go take a look at what the original empty space looked like, how we converted it into my new workshop, and then we'll take a tour. And yeah, if you hang around, you're going to get to see this cool crane move my machines. Trust me, I should have charged admission for this. As I pointed out in the last video, the new workshop is in the basement of my new house, which is shaped like this. It's roughly 2,500 square feet, and of course, being a basement, it has mechanicals in it. You know, heating and air conditioning and things of that type. So my plan was to frame those things in, put them in closets, which I could use for storage, and to keep them, away from the workshop dust. With an area this large, I only need to use the left half of this basement for my workshop, and the other half can be used for my other hobbies. One of the nice things about the new basement was that it was very well insulated, as you can see. But that was the only good news. It had essentially no lighting, and the floor was filthy. It had the original construction dirt from when the house was built. So the first thing we had to do was power wash the floor, then we acid etched it, and finally we epoxied the entire basement floor. Next step was to order the materials that we were going to need to frame in the basement. And as you can see, it's a lot of material. I hired a couple of guys to carry all of this stuff down into the basement because I was in no mood to do that. And once that was done, we were able to begin the framing and start to build the workshop. And finally, we were able to paint the entire workshop white to take best advantage of the light. And now the fun begins, getting my machines down this outdoor flight of stairs and into the basement. You can see that the bottom step and the threshold need to be bridged to safely lower the machines. So the first step was to lower a big plate of steel to make that bridge. And yeah, they moved this huge crane into my driveway in order to move all the machines. These guys are incredible. Once that steel plate was in place, the rest of the job was, well, these guys would say, easy. All we needed to do was put the machines on my pallet jack and wheel them into the workshop. First up is my lathe. Now, these machines weigh about 3,000 pounds or so, and the movers constantly ribbed me about my little machines because they typically move these giant machines, as you can see from the equipment that they have. This was just an off day for them. They didn't have a big job to do, so they sent most of the crew out, and there were probably 5 trucks in my driveway with all sorts of equipment on them. And they just sort of did this almost as a hobby for them. But for me, it was a godsend because I didn't know how else I would get these machines down into the basement. By the way, this is Pedowitz moving company. They do the whole east coast of the United States, and some of the equipment they have is just incredible. And these guys are great to work with. You've probably noticed that they're using hand signals to communicate with the crane driver. And it's pretty obvious that they do this all day, every day. But here they are lowering my lathe onto that steel plate. And then once it's on the pallet jack, they'll just wheel it into the workshop. Next up was my milling machine. You'll notice that I removed the sheet metal enclosures from both the mill and the lathe because the straps would have just crushed them. But there are other reasons, and I'll discuss that later in the video. Once again, it was no big deal for them to move this machine. And once they had it down on the steel platform, they just wheeled it into the shop. Easy peasy. Moving my smaller machines, like my bandsaw and my drill press, was no problem at all for these guys. And then what was really nice, I had ordered some new tool carts and cabinets that were stored in my garage. And although I hadn't contracted these guys to move them downstairs, they just offered to do it, no extra charge. To me, that's the best way to run a business. You could see at the end they decided some things are just easier to carry than to go through all this fancy stuff. So, let's take a tour of the new workshop. As you walk in, the first thing you see is my milling machine, sitting here on the right. Behind it, I've set up two large tool chests. Now these are new, they weren't in my old workshop. They have nice solid wood tops on them, and the drawers are enormous, and as you can see, there are lots of them. What this lets me do is keep all of the accessories and tools that I use for the mill right here at the mill with easy access. And over on the other side, by the lathe, another identical tool chest, and again, everything I need, all my cutting tools, drill bits, everything I use for the lathe is right here. And there are also drawers with my wrenches and screwdrivers and socket sets and, well, everything that you use on a regular basis. Next, you can see that I built workbenches all around the room, and this first one is for metrology, which is just a fancy word for measuring. And you can see on the right, I have my granite surface plate, I have my height gauge, and then on the back, in those boxes, I have all my gauge blocks and my gauge pins. There's a shelf up top for all the books and manuals that I need. And in this little tool cart, I've got my indicators and other measuring equipment. Next is a big long workbench where I spend most of my time. There's a TV. That's just for my amusement. And then my CAD workstation, which I use quite a bit. Next over, I have assembly area where I've got my electronics workshop where I can do soldering and such. Up above, there are plenty of bins with all the little screws and fasteners and bearings and all the things that you accumulate over the years. You can see here I've been playing around with some servos because I do intend to get back to my T800 project. And yes, for those of you who are new to my channel, I am building the endoskeleton for the arm of a T800. I've been working on it for, 9 months or so, and I've already made, I think there are 170 parts here. And this is the most challenging thing I've ever worked on. And I'm looking forward to getting back to it. The servos I just mentioned will be used to animate the arm. The fun part about digging up my old workshop, which was everything was piled on top of everything, was some of the things I found. And here, this is actually my erector set that I had as a child back in the 1950s. And yeah, it's still there. It still works. I mean, for me, it's just a reminder that I've been making things all my life. Over here in the corner, I've got some nice tall cabinets where I've got all sorts of useful things that are easy access but out of the way. And then along the back wall, there's another big long workbench. And this has the things that tend to make a mess, cutting tools and such, buffers and tumblers. And, well, they don't make a mess, but the rest of the stuff does, sanding, grinding, a big chop saw where I've got John Saunders base on it, and you can see I've built it right into the table so I can put nice long pieces down, and they're supported on both ends. And more sanding equipment and a horizontal bandsaw. Now back here in this corner, this is all my material storage. And this was another one of those, I can't believe I've got this much, because when I dug out my old workshop, I found material that had been buried for years that I didn't even know I had. So naturally, I kept ordering new material to replace the material I didn't know I had. And, well, finally now it's organized, and I've got quite a bit of material to play with. Next up is my vertical bandsaw, my drill press, easy access to them and plenty of light. Behind them is a shelf with all the things that you typically need, like drill bits, and these were never anywhere near the drill press before. And these are not the ones that I use on CNC. These are just, well, old drill bits, but they're great for a drill press. Over here I've got two nice work surfaces which I've never had before. Places to put things, places to assemble things. And if you notice, there are air hoses hanging down from the ceiling pretty much throughout the workshop. What we did when we put this thing together was we took the two compressors, which make way too much noise, and put them completely on the other side of the building. They're in a closet, in fact. And with that arrangement, you don't jump out of your skin every time the compressors come on, because they used to be right next to me, and, well, you know how loud they can be. I shot one more walkthrough of the workshop using a wider lens to give you a better perspective of the space. As you can see, the milling machine and the lathe are centered in the workshop, and they're the things I use most often, obviously. And then over here, you can see where I've got my cutting tools, my material storage. All of that stuff is along the back wall. The big boxed-in area in the center of the room, I pointed out earlier in the video, I boxed in the mechanicals, so there's a big heat and air conditioning unit inside there. The workbenches are actually 24 feet long, the two long ones. And here we come back around to the mill and the lathe. What amazes me every time I come down here is that everything you see here, except for some of the new tool carts that I pointed out, all of it used to be crammed into a small 1.5 car garage. It's amazing that I ever got anything done with all the moving around of things I had to do just to make room for the next thing I wanted to do. So, obviously, I'm very pleased with the way the new workshop turned out. I mentioned earlier that I had to remove the sheet metal enclosures from my machines, and I also said that there were other reasons that I had to do this. One of them is that the table that's supplied with the enclosure to support the keyboard, mouse, and shuttle device is ridiculously small. So the first thing I did was replace that on both the mill and the lathe with a larger one. But most of the issue was the main enclosure itself. There are things that have always annoyed me about it, mostly involving access to the machine when you want to clean it and change vices and such. First of all, on my machine, That Tormach label up at the top hung down about another 6 inches or more, and every time I reached inside the machine, I would bang my head on it. So the first thing I did was engineer that up higher so it would always be clear and out of the way. One of the other issues is that the two side panels you see outside the doors, they were fixed, and it never allowed you to get inside the machine the way you would like. So what I did was re-engineer it to put the doors up on these drawer slides, and then take the side panels and connect them to these rather huge piano hinges to support the weight. I found those on McMaster. I also had to back up the sheet metal with some 1/8 inch aluminum sheet in order to make it more rigid. And now, as you can see, I have full access to the machine while still using the original enclosure. One of the other things I did is improve the lighting. The sockets were only able to hold a single bulb. You can find these screw-in fixtures that convert one socket into 3, and if you use LED bulbs which give off very little heat, you can greatly increase the amount of light inside the machine, as you can see. Another thing I did while I had it apart was I bought the Tormach kit for flood coolant and added that on. I normally use the fog buster, which is a misting device, and that satisfies most of the cutting that I do. But every once in a while, having flood coolant is nice. And then I added this simple little switch down there, which switches back and forth between flood and mist coolant. You'll note a washdown hose in the upper right-hand corner of the enclosure. That was a simple addition once I added flood coolant. All I had to do was add a Y adapter to the pump, and when I need to use the washdown hose, I just walk behind the enclosure and turn a valve. And speaking of the fog buster, it comes with a very small solenoid which often tends to stick in the on position, leaving the coolant on. I chose to replace that solenoid with a more industrial one. All I had to do was add an aluminum plate up on top to support the larger solenoid, and then I held it down with some hose clamps. On the lathe, I also expanded the size of the table, and my lathe leaked like a sieve, and of course the lathe uses flood coolant exclusively. So when I put the enclosure back together, both on the lathe and on the mill, I put a ton of silicone everywhere. It made a mess, but it should mitigate the problem of leakage. If you'd like to see me use this new workshop to finish my T800, make sure you subscribe to my channel. If you're new to my channel and want to catch up on the T800 build so far, there's a playlist in the video description. I will see you all soon.